Well, we seem to have made it through the 2021 version of conference realignment. We've made it through rivalry week, and now we're looking forward to the most special time in college football, bowl season. So I thought this would be a good time to take a pulse check and see where we landed in regards to all the movement from conference realignment. And I want to talk a little bit about why I don't actually think it's over. There are a number of factors that are still moving in the background that, while we focus on the end of the year, are probably going to surface in the off season. So let's take a look at where we are. One thing I wanted to highlight was that even though we talk about Power 5 conferences and Group of 5 conferences, technically each one of these conferences, or the teams in the conferences, or the teams playing independent FBS football, all match the same criteria for the football bowl subdivision in Division I football. And so technically there's no real difference. We don't actually know where the term Power 5 and Group of 5 came from. We can only really assume it came from the media, or maybe even from the Power 5 conferences themselves trying to kind of separate themselves from the group. But the fact is, right now, all of the teams playing in these conferences or independently are playing at the same level. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, but I think it's important for us to recognize that. So what are the differences between Power 5 and Group of 5? Really, the Power 5 group are considered to be the elite programs in college football, but let's face it, not all of the teams in these Power 5 conferences are elite. There are plenty of teams that are basically bottom dwellers, but have some grace due to their association with other good teams in their conference. These conferences are considered to have autonomy by the NCAA right now. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later. They're typically the biggest in size and have the largest endowment. They probably have the largest athletic budgets. Not all of them, but most of them. They are considered the most competitive in play, or maybe the most consistently competitively play. And the real distinguisher, I think, is that where we get these notion is that these teams, if they win their conference championship, they automatically qualify, according to the media, based on strength of schedule for the college football playoff. So the Group of 5, looking on the right, they fulfill, as I mentioned earlier, all the requirements to play FBS football, but they're typically considered programs with either less resources or prestige. And if they win their conference championship, it's not guaranteed that they'll go to the college football playoff. Now, before we had the college football playoff, we had the BCS, so they were known as non-AQ conferences, or BCS busters. And that's really the only difference. And a lot of that difference is just the fact that there wasn't a conference, or there wasn't a college football playoff at the FBS level because of bowl games. And they're trying to eke it in there, and so of course there's a lot of opinions about where the team should be, and that's really the real distinction here. One thing I wanted to highlight too is that to play in the football FBS or football bowl subdivision, schools need to make a real big investment in what they're doing here. If you look here on the left, you got to sponsor 16 sports. You must play at least 60% of your games against other FBS teams. Being in a conference that has FBS football is a real sincere investment. One thing I wanted to highlight here was the attendance requirements. So in previous videos, I was talking about how I didn't understand how some FCS teams could come up because they really didn't match the average attendance. The rule is that they must have an average of 15,000 in paid or actual attendance at a game at least once every 2 seasons. So there's quite a bit of leeway in there. We don't know what it means to have a paid attendance. Effectively, you could have 15,000 paid tickets and nobody in the stadium and still qualify for FBS football. It's kind of a curious rule. We'll see how it goes in the future. Obviously, for FCS, there's a much less investment in money and resources. So let's take a look at where we started. Before the season started, we had these basic Power 5 conferences with this makeup, and it'd been that way for several years, maybe a decade. The group of 5 teams were the following. Again, we'd had this for a good long time. Look how big Conference USA was. A lot of teams there. And of course, we had a fair amount of independents from the last round of conference realignment. Few folks got eked out. And of course, there's the perennial independents like Notre Dame. So let's take a look at the change. So the big movement here really was this movement of Oklahoma and Texas from the Big 12 to the SEC. So 2 programs moving to the SEC. The Big 12 then needed to replace those 2 programs. And, you know, they were very prominent programs, big programs with lots of history. So they needed to replace those 2 programs in the Big 12. The Big 12 decided to invite Brigham Young, which was an independent, and three schools from the American Athletic Conference. So Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF. Now, look, I don't want to get into politics. I don't really care about anything. But if you don't believe in trickle-down economics and you watch college football, I think you probably need to sit in the corner with a Milton Friedman book and take a new lesson. Because here we've got 2 big programs leaving a big conference. They replace it with 4, right? And well, what happens then? Well, then the American needs to replace their big programs, right? So their big programs being Cincinnati, Houston, UCF, right? Well, there we go. The American then decides to invite 6 smaller programs, or maybe not as prestigious programs, to the American to replace the 3 that left. So, I don't know. You tell me. I don't know. You can debate that till the cows come home, but it's pretty evident where this leads to. One thing to note, looking at the American, every one of those teams in the American, with the exception of Navy, played in the CUSA at one time, and probably, I should say, played in the CUSA recently, say within this, since the 2000s. So it's just moving up, right? Or you could call it a lateral move. At this point, it looks like CUSA 2.0. So, anyways. Then the Sun Belt pulled off a move that I thought is probably the most aggressive and impressive move during this whole realignment. They decided to invite Marshall, Old Dominion, and Southern Mississippi, who were left in this Conference USA, into the Sun Belt Conference. And prior to that, some would say that the Sun Belt was a lesser conference than CUSA, but they definitely have teams or schools, if you will, that are really invested in their athletics program and trying to rise and play good competition. They also invited James Madison, which came from the FCS ranks, but they really were a top-tier FCS team. They were top 10. They'd had a national championship in the last 10 years. They had facilities that rival or much better than some other FBS schools, and so they fit in that great footprint that the Sun Belt is really trying to bolster up, that regional footprint. So then we've got Conference USA, which I've detailed out in my other videos. Certainly, they were they were a little bit of the losers in this game. There's no doubt. You can't deny the fact that if you lose 9 schools out of your conference, that you're down a little bit. But I think they did a great job of retooling or refactoring where they are in their state and rebuilding their conference with some schools that they can start anew with. So they've got Jacksonville State from FCS and Sam Houston State from FCS, and then the 2 schools that they added that were playing FBS football were independent. Liberty's doing pretty well. New Mexico State's got some growth, but they definitely have the resources to elevate their game. Last one is the independents. UConn and UMass got left out again. It's not surprising. Both UConn and UMass really haven't been winning, and they don't have a lot of resources invested. Notre Dame is really considered in the Power 5. I think that's wholly debatable. They were pretty middling for many years here, but they seem to be up this year again. And then Army is stayed independent, which I think is a really good move, and I will talk about in another video. I think it's a great move for them. So here we have the geographic makeup of FBS football for 2023. Whenever I look at this map, I'm always interested to note how many programs are east of the Mississippi or east of the Rocky Mountain West. And it's kind of fascinating to look at how conferences end up aligning with each other. Something to think about in the future, I think, is how the demographics of the United States are changing. A lot of people are leaving those coasts to go to either the Rocky Mountain West or the Midwest for a better lifestyle. I don't know if that'll affect college football much, but we'll see what happens. So let's take a look at the geographic makeup of the rest of the conferences. So here's the new American, or as I call it, CUSA 2.0. The ACC had no change, but as I mentioned, there are movements in the background that I think will probably affect the ACC in the future. We'll see how it goes. Big Ten, no change. I also think the Big Ten is posturing in the background. We might see some movement for them in the future. Maybe not this year, but probably in the following year. The Big 12, they're the ones who had a little bit of change here. So they added BYU way out there in the West. That definitely changed up the geographic makeup. Cincinnati was a great add, kind of as a travel partner with Western Virginia. And UCF, even though they're a bit of an outlier from a location standpoint, that really allows recruiting to enter into Florida, which I think is interesting. We always think about the Big 12 traditionally being in that true Midwest powerhouse. So this could change the makeup of how the Big 12 competes. CUSA, I've done extensive videos on this. I don't really need to belabor the point anymore, with the exception of saying this footprint changed very little. They just added new schools within the footprint that they had, and they're rebuilding. They're in the Phoenix stage. They're going to rise from the ashes, if you will. FBS Independents, Notre Dame, UConn, UMass, I would love to see them find themselves in a conference that really matches both their region and their level of play. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Army's smart for staying independent. Here's the MAC. Now, they tried to make a move to get Middle Tennessee and Western Kentucky down here, which seems to have fit, probably would have fit. They're a little bit of an outlier, but I think the MAC, is so self-contained. They're a great regional conference, and they're smaller schools that fit within that Big Ten conference area. I think they're doing well, but I'd like to see a little bit of new blood added in. I think, that might help them elevate their game. Mountain West didn't change. We know that was no change by choice. They decided that if they had school, they would just dilute the funds that they had between each other. Mountain West is an interesting conference. People keep talking about Boise State moving to the Pac-12, which I think is an absolute joke. The school is a fine school, but it's not a Pac-12 school. Pac-12, as I mentioned, no change. And then lastly, the Sun Belt Conference. To me, this is the most exciting move. As I mentioned, they made a great play for Marshall up here in the north, with adding JMU. So they've extended their footprint a little bit, but they're really within striking distance of several schools, keeping it a regional conference. What else did they add? Old Dominion, right? So Old Dominion. And Southern Miss, right? So they're right there with USA and Louisiana. So once again, back to the geographic makeup, that's where we landed for conference realignment for the beginning of 2023. Now, let's talk a little bit about why I don't think that conference realignment is over. I think we just took a little pause to play some bowl games and see where we land out for the national championship this year. I think that there are a ton of factors right now that are changing that are really going to impact college football. And I don't know if it's for the better, for the worse, or what, but let's take a look at those factors. So there are at least 6 or 7 factors that I think that are going on in the background right now that are going to make college football almost a constant change, at least for the next few years. So first one is the new NCAA Constitution. We talked about the changes they made this summer. There definitely is a notion that the Power 5 conferences are making a power play to kind of separate themselves from the rest of FBS. The NIL, the name, image, and likeness rule, which is associated with the new constitution of the NCAA, but we'll talk a little bit about how that's affecting things. Obviously, the nature of TV and digital networks is really changing. It's changing in the landscape of our lives as Americans, but also that really affects uh, college football, because that has been the touted reason that people are moving conferences, right? They want more exposure and they want more payout. But I think people need to rethink that. I don't think there's as much power as we think that there are now, and that social media is thrown in there as well. We got to think about the future of education in colleges. There's a lot of movement there and a lot of disruption there. You can't have a game that's associated with a college have the seminal experience of the college change at a core level and not have it affect the game. We have some new professional leagues, which might be interesting. And of course, we have to think about the future of American life. There are smaller crowds and changing interests. And so these are the factors I think that conference realignment is basically going to be a constant thing for now. Technically it was constant for a while, but I think the speed or the vitesse, if you will, of it will increase. So the first one is that the NCAA this summer gave us a few draft pages of their updated constitution, which basically told us what we knew for a long time, is that they're a lame duck organization. They basically said they're getting out of the business of governing anything, which wasn't that the point of the NCAA? It just sort of blows my mind that they would say, okay, we're getting out of the game of creating rules and holding them. Well, I don't know what they're going to do then in the future. Basically, they said in their new draft that they're going to let the divisions and the conferences make their own decisions about how to apply rules. Now, that's kind of interesting, right? Because if you have conferences applying different rules different ways, you're going to find all kinds of reasons for players to be at different schools based on how they apply those rules. So we're getting into this kind of crazy area, total Wild West of what it means to play college football. And so for that reason, I think that we're going to find all kinds of shifts. We're going to find reasons that players want to be at different schools that we wouldn't expect they'd be at historically, based on their talent level, but also based on overall life quality. Now, the NCAA has mentioned that they're trying to simplify college sports, and because it has a complex and outdated rule book. There is no doubt that is true. I think they've had a huge overreach. So it's a good thing. I think it's a good effort that they're trying to scale back and deregulate themselves. But we definitely are kind of going into a Wild West situation where how that gets applied, the NCAA could go away. Now, I think this P5 power play definitely is one of the instigators to this NCAA deregulation. At this point, there are just huge gaps in the level of investments for schools that play FBS football. Let's take a look at here. The athletic budget for University of Texas at Austin is $223 million, basically 224 million. And I was surprised that Louisiana Tech had the smallest athletic budget by the numbers that I could find at the NCAA for 2019, by the way. 24 million. So basically 10%. Their athletic budget is 10% of the largest athletic budget, and they're playing in the same division of football. They're saying, how do you bridge that gap? How do you have competitive play? I don't know that there's always a need to have that. One of the things I love about college football is that the underdog could beat the blue chip any day of the week. That's why we love the NCAA tournament, right? The Cinderella story is intriguing. It's powerful. It's cool. So I think the P5 programs are trying to separate themselves from the rest of FBS football. They could create a new division there. And of course, if you look at this quote here, it says revenue allocation was the most contentious part of their discussions. Of course, that's a big deal. And then the Knight Commission that did a study on this said that maybe there should be a revenue sharing model, probably a lot like the NFL. Now, it's interesting to think about because the NCAA Constitution is about all divisions, 1, 2, and 3. And, there's some debate about what this is about. I love this quote from the Caltech athletic director. She said, look, the motivation to make major changes came from a place of fear and money and power. It's not really about making things better for the student athlete, which I tend to have to believe. We've watched this over the last few decades just crumble, and it's just kind of like, I don't know, lame duck organization totally. So it says here that the three divisions can now go forth and create rules and bylaw structures for their unique circumstances. That seems less like solidarity and more like fend for yourself. And then, of course, the recommendation from the Knight Commission was maybe that FBS separate from the rest of college football. That's definitely going to make an impact. I think that's in motion. It's probably going on in the background all the time. I wouldn't be surprised if that were to happen in the next couple of years. Another reason that that has an impetus is because the college football playoff for FBS teams is expanding, and then you're getting more TV revenue from that. So I think that's another reason for us to believe that the P5 separation is probably imminent. It's just a matter of time. Now, the interesting thing about that would be is that these programs that are in these Power 5 conferences may not come along, meaning that if they get into this college football playoff system, they may be sort of excluding some of the lesser programs within these P5 conferences. So that will be something interesting to watch and see if that happens. Now, here's my favorite one, is the name, image, likeness rule. Basically, college football players can be paid by companies to support themselves with their name, image, and likeness, and this happened this summer. At this point, it's regulated by the state, so that's an interesting thing to think about. And we have the perfect example in Jared Casey. If you remember, a few weeks ago, Kansas upset Texas. Jared Casey made the go-ahead touchdown catch to win the game. He was basically a walk-on from Kansas. He grew up in a small town in Kansas. He always loved Kansas football, so he joined the Kansas football team. Now, if you're anybody of high athletic ability, most people probably wouldn't go to Kansas unless it's your sort of only chance to play FBS football. But here you've got a guy who makes one play. I don't think he had played many games at all, or maybe at all. Before that game, he made one play, and now he's got an endorsement. So you have to think about athletes, or student athletes, if you will, thinking about their quality of life other than just the golden ticket of a scholarship, right? So in the future, if Kansas elevates its game, or maybe it doesn't elevate its game at all, and you have a blue chip recruit who wants to stay home but knows that he can support himself or have an opportunity to get endorsements, he may go to what you might consider a lesser team, get more playing time, and have a higher quality of life, if you will, than if they went to Alabama and he rode the bench for 3 years on a depth chart that has, superstar after superstar. I think the name, image, and likeness thing, it will take a few years to really kind of get footing, but that's something that could change the face of college football and create parity where we haven't seen it before. So it's kind of interesting. TV streaming, digital networks, and no social media. So TV today, the TV contracts dominate the Power 5. The Power 5 conferences, they dominate the amount of money that are paid out to each school with these contracts. But in the future, I think that will be diluted, right? So typically what we have now is we have these TV networks, the traditional TV networks, they're evolving into the streaming networks, right? Netflix, Amazon Prime, and YouTube, Hulu, that kind of thing. And there are more, streaming networks coming up. Fubo TV does some broadcast. One thing to note too is the digital networks. Every conference now has a digital network where they can replay their conference games on that. And sometimes they stream. So if they don't have national coverage with a TV contract, they're streaming through a digital network. I mean, look at what I'm doing now. I'm basically sitting in my room talking to you guys over YouTube. And that's the power of a TV network, right? And then we think about social media, how that might affect the game too. So I actually think TV contracts are going to count for less and less as we go on in the future of technology. But they have a lot of power. They always have a lot of power, and so we'll see. But I think that smaller conferences could find themselves with better situations to get exposure. with the fact that TV networks used to be a barrier to entry, and now almost anybody has one in their house. So we'll see how that affects things. But I do think it's a consideration, and maybe one that the big Power 5 conferences underestimate. This point is interesting. I think, it doesn't affect everything, but it is something to think about. We have new professional leagues, right? So last year we had the AAF that kind of folded. We have the XFL, which is coming back, and they probably did the best job of establishing a new spring league. USFL is coming back this year, which I find fascinating. I loved the USL when it existed before. And the CFL is expanding, right? There's the Spring League, of course, which is a development league. But all I'm saying here is that there are new growth opportunities for football players that may want to find a new role or way to develop their abilities outside of the college game or on their way to the NFL. There's a lot more movement available for players. So this is one that I think is really interesting, the future of education in colleges. Now, I can't imagine that the blue chip programs are affected much by this, but very possibly is that the future of education is changing, the future of college is changing. And like I said earlier, you can't have a game that's intrinsically tied to the college experience and not have it affect the game. There is some prediction that over half of American colleges will be bankrupt in a few years. And, if I'm an athlete, let's say I don't get a scholarship, why would I want to spend $105,000 on an education I could get by staying home and doing online education, right? So what is the value of that scholarship? What is the value of what I'm adding to my life by playing college football? And the last point, which I think we really don't know how to predict the future, but there's no doubt that there have been smaller crowds over the last several years. Obviously, COVID had a big impact on that now. But even prior to COVID, schools were reporting smaller and smaller game attendances. Typically, that was with the students, so newer generations really don't necessarily really engage in the game in the same way historically it has been. I know that at the University of Wisconsin, they even went from 89,000 capacity to, I think it was 83, maybe 85. So they're opting to put in more luxury type experiences like luxury boxes and have a less attendance. I think that's a huge factor for college football. I don't think people engage with it in the same way that they did 20 years ago. And let's face it, folks, esports is the number one largest viewed, I'm going to call it entertainment. I don't know if it's a sport, but entertainment across the world. Things are much more global. We have distributed communities. So I think this is a factor that I think most athletic departments are trying to deal with on a regular basis. But it definitely could be a factor also in future realignment. Maybe like Conference USA, instead of being so regional, they double down on that streaming focus for the game. I don't know. Could be interesting. So you can pick who you think said it best, Yogi Berra or Lenny Kravitz. It's up to you. But I don't think it's going to be over for some time. I think we've probably got a next 5 years of drama of conference realignment. I'd love to hear what you have to say and what your opinions are. Please make comments in the bottom. We'll see you soon.